Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Abil Qasim Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We have been looking at the chapters of Quran known as the chapters which are mufassal, which have generally a shorter length and shorter verses, and which the basic foundational beliefs and principles of Islam are discussed in. And today, inshallah, we will look briefly at Surah al-Dhariyat, which is surah number 51 in the Quran. Like many of the other chapters revealed in Makkah and many of the shorter chapters of the Quran, Surah al-Dhariyat, it begins with a remembrance of the Day of Judgment and the skepticism that people have about resurrection and about the Day of Judgment. يَسْأَلُونَ أَيَّانَ يَوْمُ الدِّينِ. They say, when is this day of deen, this day of judgment, and this day of resurrection, when is it going to take place? And then the Quran, it gives an introduction to us of the outcome of the Day of Judgment. This surah, it contains a number of very important principles that are kind of like reminders or slogans for our life. One of them is about the state of the believers on the Day of Judgment. So when we look at the outcomes of the Day of Judgment, the Quran tells us, إِنَّ الْمُتَّقِينَ فِي جَنَّاتٍ وَعُيُونٍ. The pious will be in gardens and springs. So they will be in a very pleasant setting and filled with greenery, filled with fresh, pure water, filled with natural beauty. And that will be the setting, but then they will also have a greater beauty or a greater gift that they will be benefiting from. And what is that? That they will be in a close and an intimate connection with Allah. آخِذِينَ مَا آتَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ. They will be taking what God gives them. And if you can imagine that image which the Quran is giving us, you have the most beautiful, for lack of a better word, natural setting. We think of nature in our world, although nature in the hereafter will be very different. But the true gift is not that beauty or that setting. It is the fact that Allah will be continually giving you of His gifts. And آخِذِينَ مَا آتَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ, that will be the bounty that the pious, the muttaqeen, will receive on the Day of Judgment. So what is it that makes that gift from God special? First of all, what He gives will be beyond anything in this world. And those blessings that Allah gives of food and drink and of castles and of so many other blessings, they are hinted at in the Quran as examples, although they cannot be described in detail because our imagination and our language and our conception in this world is not able to conceive of it. But what Allah is giving us is going to be something that is beyond anything that you can experience in this world. But then, it is the fact that it comes from God that makes it special regardless of what it is. I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience that you have a possession that has sentimental value. And if anybody else were to look at it, they might think that it is trash. should go immediately into the garbage can. But you say, this is my blanket that I used to be very attached to when I was 5. And now it's threadbare, and it doesn't look like it serves any purpose, but I have a sentimental attachment to it. Or sometimes people, they have preserved maybe a card or a letter given to them from a grandparent or a mentor or a teacher when they were young, and the paper is wrinkled and it's faded, and maybe it's been rained on, and so it doesn't look like anything special. It looks like just a piece of scrap paper. But it has a great deal of value for you because of who it comes from. So sometimes things are valuable because of what they are, and sometimes they are valuable because of what they represent or what they remind you of or who they come from. And when it comes to Allah, it is both elements of beauty and greatness that apply. It comes from Allah, so it is the greatest source, and it is a heavenly gift, so it is the greatest gift. That is what is meant when Allah says, إِنَّ الْمُتَّقِينَ فِي جَنَّاتٍ وَعُيُونٍ آخِذِينَ مَا آتَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ, taking what Allah gives them. There is a connection, and there is a great thing that they are getting. So this way, the Quran, it wants to encourage us to aspire to come to that rank in paradise. And then immediately afterwards, the Quran tells us what it is that qualifies the muttaqeen to get this. And the goal here is for me not just to say that that's a beautiful image or that would be a very good thing to get, but for me to say that what do I need to do in order to achieve that favor from Allah. إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ مُحْسِنِينَ. The first attribute that the Quran mentions is that these are people who are getting their reward now, but before that, in this world, they were people of ihsan. They would show kindness and do good and show goodness to others. Ihsan is a very comprehensive concept in the Quran, and it refers to doing that which is good, to doing that which is noble. And in one conception, we can say that it is built on a foundation, and that foundation is to do what is just or fair. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. Allah commands justice, and then Allah commands goodness. So ihsan comes after adl. Sometimes we make that mistake in our life. We want to do extra credit, but we don't want to do what is required. Even on Laylatul Qadr, sometimes we want to do that special dua, that unique dua, that very beautiful dua. We want to find out what is it that can get all of my hajat answered, what is it that can get all of my sins forgiven. And yet we have many obligations that we have not taken care of. I might not have paid my khums. I might not have learned how to practice the obligations of my religion properly. I might have prayers that I have missed. I have not made them up. And now I want to know what are the nawafil and what are the recommended du'as and recommended prayers and a special dhikr that I can recite. So there is a principle that we have in Islam. Ihsan is important, and all of these are examples of ihsan. All of that goodness and all of that extra credit, it is an example of ihsan. But what is ihsan built upon? It is built upon doing what is your obligation. So if I owe you money, then I might call you every day and show kindness to you every day and offer you a gift every day, but it doesn't pay my debt. If I owe you something, then I need to pay that debt first. And once I pay it, or I at least start making the installments in order to pay it, then all of the other things that I do, they have value. But if I'm not fulfilling my basic obligation, the extra credit, it does not bring benefit. In fact, there is a hadith of our first Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, that there is no benefit in fada'il or in nawafil, إذا أضرت بالفرائض, if they contradict or if they take away or they diminish from your obligations. So the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Dhariyat that the muttaqeen who will go to paradise are those who were doers of good. They were muhsin. And ihsan is built on a foundation of doing what you are obligated to do, fulfilling your obligations, but then don't limit yourself to that. So if there's some people who ignore their obligations in order to do that extra credit, there are other people who just want to do their obligations. Look, I pray my 5 prayers, I fast in the month of Ramadan, and that's all I want to do. The rest of the time I want to watch something on TV, or I want to just relax. But if you want to get close to Allah, then use that foundation of what is the minimum in order to come closer. Then the second attribute the Quran mentions is an example of ihsan. It is an example of what is built upon the foundation of the minimum that you should do or you must do. كَانُوا قَلِيلًا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ مَا يَهْجَعُونَ. It would be a small amount of the night that they would sleep. Now this can have one of 2 meanings. One is that you are awake for most of the night and you only sleep a small portion of the night. And the other, more accurate meaning is that it is a small number of nights that you sleep through them and you don't spend a time in worship. So when you are sick, when you are tired, when you are overwhelmed, then you can sleep through the night. But if you are able, spend a portion of that night in ibadah and in dhikr and in remembrance. This is a form of ihsan. So this is building upon the minimum that we are required to do. وَبِالْأَسْحَارِ هُمْ يَسْتَغْفِرُونَ. And at the time of sahar, in the early, I should say the late night, just before the dawn and before the early morning, they do istighfar. So there are 2 things that are recommended in that early morning time of sahar. That's where we get the word sahur, which we eat, sahari. It comes from sahar. Sahar is the last 1/3 of the night, before dawn. So these days, for example, if dawn is at about 5:30, then you can say for about 2 hours before that, that is the time of sahar. What do? One is to read Quran. Inna Quran al-Fajr kana mashhuda. And the other is that you will do istighfar wa bil asharihum yastaghfirun. Seek forgiveness from Allah at that time of solitude and contemplation. That is the best time to read the Quran and remember it, and the best time to do istighfar and for it to have an effect on your soul. Then the third attribute, I should say the fourth attribute, if we count ihsan as the first one, ihsan is one attribute. Then not sleeping every night, all night, is the second attribute. Doing istighfar is the third attribute. The fourth attribute, وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. Fourth attribute is when Allah has given you money or wealth, then you have defined a right for those who ask and for those who are mahroom within your property. Now, this is not referring to your obligation. So don't say, well, I give khums, I give zakat, I give fitrah. That is not your property. That is, according to a hadith, the right and the property of those who are recipients. So let's say, for example, that I was in a very difficult situation in my life. I was about to be kicked out of my home, and I come to you and I say, can you pay me 6 months rent as a loan so that I can stay in my home, and then when I get back on my feet, I will start to pay you back. And maybe the money I took from you, it's $20,000, for example, for 6 months rent. So then if I pay you $20,000, can I say I'm very generous? No, I had borrowed it from you, I'm just paying you back what I owe you. There is no generosity, and yet when we pay khums, we feel generous. When we pay zakat, we feel generous. That is just paying a debt. That is just fulfilling an obligation. It is important, but I shouldn't feel like it brings me any kind of special honor or special rank. Sometimes people will come and they will say that, well, I want this to be spent in this way. If it's a debt you are paying, then I don't tell you when I'm paying you back, but I want you to use this money to put in your retirement account. Because what will you say? It's not yours. Your job was to pay me, and now it is my prerogative to decide what do I do with that money. It's my property. So khums belongs to the imam, and it is to be used in the causes that Ahlul Bayt have taught us. Zakat belongs to the needy. Allah has given it to you as a trust, you can convey it to them. But then you cannot tell them how they are to use it, because it is their property, not yours. So this verse, and then the verse of Surah Al-Ma'arij, which is similar, that we'll talk about perhaps in the coming days, these are referring to a voluntary gift. So let's say, for example, I have savings. This year, let's say I have $5,000 of savings. So I will pay khums. If I have $5,000 of savings, what is my khums obligation? $1,000. I pay the khums. $4,000 is mine. That is my right to spend or to save as I see fit. This $4,000 is what the verse is referring to. That within that which is yours, nobody has a claim on it. Now you say, وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ. You give a right, and you say that this is more than my need. So there is a right that I will pay to two groups of people. As-sa'il, those who they ask me. Maybe people from my family or from my community, they come, they say, can you help me? Can you give me a loan? Or can you give me assistance? That's one category, I try to help them. Then the Quran adds another category, and this is the ihsan that Quran is calling us towards. When it says that إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ مُحْسِنِينَ, they used to be doers of good. So the Quran is telling us, don't just give to those who ask. That's easy. But ihsan is that you say, I owe money to those who are mahroom. Mahroom means those who are deprived of God's sustenance and they don't have their needs, but they don't ask. If they ask, they are sa'il. There are many people, because of their own pride, because of their own dignity, because of their own humility, they're never going to ask somebody, can you help me? And then sometimes we think that, well, if they want my help, they should ask. They should come to me. Sometimes we actually want to hear people maybe ask before we offer. The Quran says ihsan is one step beyond that. Yes, give to those who ask. But then seek out those people who are mahroom, who are in difficulty. And now they don't come to you, you go to them. Not to do a favor, but because they are doing you a favor. The Quran is telling us these attributes in terms of what? In terms of what is going to bring me to paradise. So if I find somebody who is mahroom, then I don't say that here I'm going to do you a favor and give you a loan or give you assistance. I will say, can you do me a favor and can you take this from me? Why? Because that is going to be a basis for my own salvation. So it is a very beautiful and an eloquent definition of ihsan that the Quran is giving us. So 4 attributes. These are attributes that we should aspire to, and sometimes they may seem difficult. But remember that there is a 2-step process. The first step is develop the attribute of adala. Do your duties and your obligations. And if you fulfill your duties and your obligations, then, first of all, you will find it easier to move one step beyond that, and the very doing of your obligation will motivate you to go one step beyond that. Don't stop there. go one step beyond and try to become among the muhsineen. To spend the time in worship and in istighfar, and to give assistance with what Allah has given you to those who ask you and to those who are in need, even if they don't ask. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, as I said, there are short reminders in this surah, and I will just look at a few more of these reminders and then we will conclude. One of them is verse number 22, where Allah says, وَفِي السَّمَاءِ رِزْقُكُمْ وَمَا تُوعَدُونَ. There is a hadith from Ahlul Bayt that why is it that you look towards the heavens when you do dua? قَدْ نَرَى تَقَلُّبَ وَجْهِكَ فِي السَّمَاءِ. The Prophet, when he was trying to get divine guidance about the Qibla, when the Jews would mock the Muslims for facing their Qibla, which they considered to be their Qibla, Quds, Jerusalem, and the Prophet looked towards the heavens. If Allah does not have a place, and if Allah is not a body, and if Allah is not in the sky or in the earth, then it shouldn't make a difference where you look. But the Quran says, وَفِي السَّمَاءِ رِزْقُكُمْ وَمَا تُوعَدُونَ. You look towards the heavens according to the hadith of Ahlul Bayt, because in the sky is your sustenance, meaning the rainwater that brings to life agriculture and brings the world to life, that falls from the sky. وَمَا تُوعَدُونَ, and the promise that comes, it comes from the heavens, it comes from on high. So it isn't that Allah is over there and not here, but rather that there is a spiritual and a psychological and an emotional benefit for us to look towards the heavens and to look towards the vastness of God's creation and to seek rizq and وَمَا تُوعَدُونَ, what Allah has promised us from the heavens. So that comes from that divine source. Then the surah, it mentions the example of a number of prophets. The example of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, the example of Prophet Lut, the example of Musa alayhi salam, the example of Ad, the example of Thamud, Prophet Hud and Prophet Saleh, and the example of Prophet Nuh, although he came in history earlier, but in the surah he's mentioned afterwards. And this is not a surah that mentions details of the story. It just tells us that these prophets, they struggled and they conveyed the message to their communities and then they were belied. When the Quran lists these stories, and it doesn't give us the details, but it just gives us the reminder, there is a very important lesson. The lesson is that don't get caught up in the details. Don't get caught up in, did this prophet live in this country or that country? Was it 5,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago? Recognize that even though there are hundreds of years, and in fact thousands of years between these prophets in time, and there might be hundreds or thousands of miles between their lands in space, but there is one essence to their story. And that essence is true of our time and our lives as well. That every human being is called upon and is tested by Allah and will be judged by Allah on the basis of our decisions and our actions. And then just one more verse and then we will conclude. The Quran, it says in Surah Al-Dhariyat verse 55, وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Addressing the Prophet, remind the believers. Indeed, reminding benefits the believers. Or we have in the other chapters of the Quran in Surah Al-A'la also, فَذَكِّرْ إِن نَفَعَتِ الذِّكْرَ. Remind, because reminding is beneficial. In our time and in our culture, we have this tendency to get bored very easily. If you remember, those of you who are older, there was a time when people would share YouTube videos of an hour-long speech. Then a time came when we started sharing 10-minute YouTube clips. And now you get a 1-minute short, and people are fast-forwarding even through that. What's the essence of this? There was a time when we used to read books, and then it moved to articles. Then those same articles that people used to read regularly, they became known as a long read. Nothing has changed, but why is it a long read? Our attention span has grown short. It hasn't grown longer. So no longer do we read books, and then no longer do we read articles, but then we say, okay, what's the executive summary? You know, people have that footnote, too long, didn't read, so just give it to us in a few sentences. And then we think we know what we're talking about, and we get bored and we move on. Remember, فَذَكِّرْ إِن نَفَعَتِ الذِّكْرَى. In Islam, don't get bored of something because you've heard it before, and don't ignore something because it's not flashy and exciting. Sometimes the most important relationships in life are the ones that we take for granted. And sometimes the most important information for our life is that which is right at our fingertips, that which is right in front of us. That's what we're most likely to forget. It's true of relationships, and it's true of guidance. فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. O Prophet, remind them. Reminding is good. And that is one of the purposes of the Quran. The name of the Quran, one of the names of the Quran is Al-Dhikr. So don't think of it as a book that you're familiar with or that you've read, or that now you want to move on to bigger and better things. There is nothing bigger, there is nothing better than that message that brings life to us and reminds us. So there are a number of very important messages in Surah Al-Dhariyat. The stories of the prophets are mentioned in brief, a reminder that all of those stories, they speak to the shared test of every human being, and that's the lesson we learn from the prophets. There is a call to move beyond just the baseline of fulfilling our obligations and enter into that attribute of ihsan. And there is a reminder that dhikr is important for our spiritual progress and advancement and constancy. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us all to benefit from these messages of the Quran, to remember the Day of Judgment, not just to try to get our foot into paradise, but to try to honor all of the opportunities Allah has given us by earning the highest rank in paradise that we are able. Learn the lessons from the stories of the prophets, and to constantly strive to remind ourselves of the teachings of our religion, so they're not just in our mind, but they enter into our heart, they become part of our character, they become an inseparable part of our lives and our identity. And may Allah guide and protect all of us and grant us success and salvation in this life and the hereafter. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.